you better report my computer
Time to rejoin the
so I can send the invitation.
Veronica.
Okay. Okay. Tom, you have the floor.
Okay. So, if we move too far ahead in prayer, then when the people come next week, we'll have to start again. But did we talk a bit about prayer last week?
Yeah, we did. We were supposed to talk about meditation.
Okay, we'll talk about meditation. You want to talk about meditation today?
I forgot.
Okay. So let's begin by thinking about what are the powers of the human soul. We all have a human soul, and it has definite powers. Now, we also have a body, and it has powers. What are the powers of the human body?
Physical.
Yeah, what are they? What are the means whereby the physical body can perceive the world?
5 senses.
Okay, what are they?
Taste, sight, hearing, smell,
Touch.
What else?
Taste.
Taste, good. What do you got? Touch, taste, sight, smell, and hearing. Okay, so there are 5. Now, if you didn't have these 5 senses, how well would you be able to perceive the world?
you would be handicapped in some
You would be handicapped. Would you agree? Now, if you don't have one of them and have the other 4, can the other 4 make up for the loss of the other one?
No.
Not to any great extent. In other words, they don't overlap in their powers. Would you agree? You know, maybe slightly a deaf person, or say a blind person, their ears will get a little stronger. Would you agree?
Yes.
And so on. But to a very great extent, if you don't use all 5 of your senses, you're going to miss out on a whole chunk of the world. So if you don't have your ears, your eyes cannot make up with it. Likewise, if I give you a chocolate ice cream right now and I hold it in front of you and I tell you to look at it forever and ever, are you going to get the value of it? What if I tell you to put it to your ear and listen to the chocolate ice cream? You want to try? Listen to it. It doesn't help. Is that what you agree? You have to taste it. But at the same time, something else you have to listen. You have to hear and so on. So if you don't use all of your 5 senses, you miss out on a whole chunk of the physical world. Now, I think God did this on purpose. I think He did this on purpose to show us that the physical world is abundant with many different kinds of things that require different kinds of perceptions, different kinds of mechanisms or sensory organs to do it. Now, what is science in the last 100 years? It's nothing but creating more sensory things that can extend human senses. You understand? So your eyes can see, but they can't see very small. So we create something that can see even smaller. And smaller and smaller, until finally we magnify it and we still can't see any smaller. Do you know why? Because light has a certain wavelength. And anything smaller than that wavelength, light can't see. So what did scientists do? Do you know what they did? They said, okay, we can no longer use microscopes or telescopes or whatever. We have to use something that is smaller light. Okay? So they get smaller and smaller light. Of course, what is smaller than light? Can anyone tell us what's smaller than light? X-rays are smaller than light, gamma rays are smaller than light, and so on. But then they get smaller than all those. So then they say, okay, well, let's bombard the things with little particles. Okay, so we fire a particle at something, an electron, and then it bounces off, and then we measure the bounce off, and we call it an electron microscope. Did you know that? So an electron microscope is not really a microscope. You can't see a thing, but it extends our ability. We learned this because we found that animals could do things we couldn't do. Did you know a dog can hear much higher than we can hear, and a cat can hear 3 times as high as you can hear? So if a mouse makes a noise, we don't hear it whatsoever. It's absolutely empty. The cat hears the mouse, just as clear as can be. You can get a little mouse whistles, blow it, and it makes no sound. The cat, comes attacking you because it thinks it's a mouse. And so we realized that animals had all kinds of senses. We finally realized that all of the senses go into the brain, and then the brain makes things happen. In other words, you don't see anything. Your brain takes the information and creates the image. Do you understand this very clearly? When I look at that table, what am I actually seeing? I'm seeing the light that comes into the room, hitting the atoms of the table, and it's messing with the atoms. But the atoms in that table are 99.999999% air. Did you know that? We're not air, but empty. Do you know that if you took, I just read this, if you took the Empire State Building, anyone seen the Empire State Building? What is it made of? Stone and glass? And probably steel structure. Took the Empire State Building and took out all of the air in the atoms of the Empire State Building. What remains will fit in 1 grain of rice. That's how much physical matter is in the Empire State Building. It only fits in a grain of rice. Now, I should warn you, the grain of rice will weigh the same as the Empire State Building. It's a very heavy grain of rice. But that's all it would, the rest of the Empire State Building is empty. So you say, how come I see the Empire State Building? You say you see it because light hits it, those little electrons, which are nothing. They're just, take a grain of rice and distribute it around the Empire State Building. Those things are bouncing around, but they send the light back in what's called photons. And that light comes back, kind of like ping pong or a tennis player, they send it back. And those electrons won't let anybody else into their little territory. Even though they're smaller than a fly in a cathedral. They say smaller than a soccer ball in a 2-mile soccer field. Can you imagine a soccer ball in a imagine a cat in a 2-mile soccer field. But the cat won't let anybody in its soccer field. You know how a cat urinates or stuff. That's what the electrons do. They say, nobody else can come in here, but we're really just empty. So our eyes perceive the physical world. How do your ears perceive sound? Who can tell me?
I was never good in science.
You don't know? Okay. You don't know how ear perceives sound? Okay, let's get this clear. If I speak right now, I am putting a wave into the air. Okay, and I'm breaking the air. I'm actually causing the air to break, and it sends a vibration in all directions. That's what happens. Now your eardrum also vibrates, and it shakes. And for some reason your brain decides to take that shake and make it hearing. But there is no sound. You made the sound in your brain. Do you understand that? You can prove this. Go into outer space. Go in the space shuttle with your friend. Go out, take your helmets off, and shout at the other person in outer space. Do you think he'll hear you? Can't hear a thing. Cannot hear one thing in outer space because without air, if you throw a rock into a puddle, do you see the thing that goes out? Okay, that's exactly the same as what you're doing. That's also a way. If you throw a rock in and there's no water, what happens? Nothing. So you need the puddle. They call this a medium by which it transfers. So all of these things mean that there's a physical world, and we have senses that can detect what it's doing. And then in our brain or our mind, we cause this to be vision. So they studied certain animals that don't have any eyes, or don't use their eyes because they live in darkness. They studied bats, they studied dolphins, whales, and so on. You know, these are creatures that their eyes are not particularly good. Okay, now bats see by clicking. They go. You know how they do that? Okay, now the reason they click is that anytime they click, the sound then comes back to their ears. Okay, and they can go in and out, they can go through that window, they can do everything, and they never bump into anything. Have you noticed that? That's all they do. Now, they now know that the bat sees. They actually have vision in their brain when they're clicking, because the input that goes into their brain from the clicking causes the brain to make it so they see walls just like you and I do. Same with dolphins. They see. So, recently, and you can look at this on YouTube, I'll send you, they took a man blind from birth, and they taught him to see like a bat. And they gave him a clicker here. He did it over and over again, and he learned it. He got so good that they showed him on the internet riding a bicycle at like 20, 30 miles an hour down a mountain path and turning. And they asked him, what's he going on? He says, I see now. Yeah. Because his brain caused the vision, because it's interpreting. Do you understand? His brain caused the vision. So we need to understand that there's a physical world, and that God has given you certain senses, powers, to partake of the physical world. But we know by the study of animals that the majority of the physical world we cannot see and we cannot detect. There's infinitely more in this world than what we see and hear. We know it because the animals can see it. The snakes can see it. They can. Certain insects can see in the infrared or the ultraviolet range. These are light ranges we can't see. Certain insects can see that. Did you know that? Birds can see in the ultraviolet. Birds can see colors that you and I have never seen before. Wouldn't you love to be a bird? To see some new color that you can't see and so on. So we know two things from this. The physical body can partake of some of the physical world, but not all of it. Have you ever seen a picture from the Hubble telescope of stars? Who's seen them? Okay. Do you think that we can see what the Hubble telescope sees? No, they're sending a different kind of wave. There's a certain kind of radio waves that our eyes can't see, and it's detecting what the matter is based on the color and various things. We have various ways. And then they bring that back, and then they convert that back to the visual spectrum. And then we say, this is what the Hubble telescope is. Hubble didn't see that. We converted what it saw to something else. I want you to listen really hard right now, right to that spot there. I want you to listen to Moscow radio. Go on, listen. Who can hear it? It's right there. It's just going shoom through there. By the way, I want you to listen to every cell phone call in Franklin right now. Listen. It's going right there. Did you know that? Every cell phone call in Franklin is just going, right through here. Why can't we detect it?
Because our body is not made like a telephone.
Well, why can the telephone detect it?
Because the waves
It's
detect.
exactly the same wave as what you see off that table, just a different frequency. It's just tuned. Like, a radio, and there's nothing, and tune, and then you tune into a frequency, and the radio picks it up. Your eyes are tuned to a certain range of frequencies, but those others are there. That's why they say
Well,
never...
is it possible that, because, for example, the table is something everybody sees. Is it possible there is a human being that sees it different?
Of course, we have no idea what she's seeing and what you're seeing.
Interesting.
There are many...
We think they're seeing the
You
same.
might be seeing that black, and she calls it black, but all her life she's called that color black. But who knows if in her mind what she calls black all her life and what you call black really looks the same. Nobody can tell. People have tried. This is an old discussion. Okay, and so the point is that we don't see everything. We definitely don't see everything. We don't hear everything, but we have physical powers that partake of the physical world. Would you all agree? Okay, now Adabaha said, you also have spiritual powers that partake of the spiritual world. And of the spiritual powers, each does a different thing. If you don't use your eyes, your ears aren't going to help you. If you don't use your ears, your eyes aren't going to help you if you don't use your taste. It's the same with spiritual powers. The first spiritual power, he says, is imagination. It's inner vision, the ability to imagine. This is a spiritual power. The animals don't have it. We know the animals don't have it. They just don't have the ability, like an animal can't sit back and imagine something. So I want you to sit back and imagine now you're on a ship sailing. Okay? How many can imagine you're on a ship sailing? Okay. This is what makes you human. That you have the ability to see without your eyes. You have inner imagination. Adabaha says this is a spiritual power. And it's a very interesting, yes.
So how do dreams work for animals?
Dreams are using that spiritual power. Because
don't also animals have dreams as well?
Animals have dreams, but so far we haven't been able to ask any animal what they were dreaming. Okay, all we know is that we don't really even know they dream. We know they have what's called REM, sleep. Okay, and sometimes they bark, and sometimes they wag their tails.
Or snore.
Well, I don't know.
Or cry.
Cookie snores.
My dog whimpers.
They whimper, yeah. They do various things, and some studies have detected that they're very motor-oriented, that they're doing things that they normally do in their motor things. Animals have a certain kind of brain, and they have a certain kind of spirit, but it's not the same as ours. It doesn't have the same... Now, you can just tell by what do animals do in the world. Animals cannot conceive something and plan it. In other words, they can't make a plan and design something and conceive it hypothetically and then carry out that plan. They just have to follow their instinct. Humans can make any plan they want in their mind and then carry it out. This is what Abdu'l-Baha said. So see what we were talking yesterday. This house could not exist if it didn't first exist in a plan. It can't exist until there's first a drawing. And the drawing has to be absolutely precise. Wouldn't you agree? It has to have every corner and everything down to the inch, not even the inch, but the small of it. Would you agree? Everything that you see that man has made had to have been in the mind of some man before. Whether he committed it to a piece of paper or a computer or just kept it in his brain, every single thing a human has ever made that distinguishes him from the animal has been made because of this power of imagination. It is the first and most important sign of man, is the power of imagination.
Spiders make webs.
I'm sorry?
Spiders make webs.
Yes, no. Certain animals, out of instinct, can build a few things. Okay?
Like a beaver with a dam?
Beavers build dams, bees build hives, birds build nests. There's some animals, but not very many animals, by the way. But that's all they do, and they do it out of instinct. In fact, you can even separate these animals from any other animal, and they will still do it. I don't know if you know this. They'll take a cat, for example, and a cat knows how to kill by reaching over the back of an animal and shaking it. You know that's how a cat kills. Have you ever seen a cat kill a mouse or a rabbit? They're very good. They go, dead. Okay. So you take a cat, you take it from the mother, the minute it just comes out of the womb, take it away. And keep it only amongst creatures that don't do that. When the cat gets to be a certain age, goes to the mouse, shakes it, kills it. It'll even do it to a toy. Did you know that? Okay. Because it's genetically inherited into the cat. Okay? So this is a different thing. This is to do with animal behavior and stuff, and you can read all about how animals have this. And you cannot go to a beaver and give him a design of anything but a dam and get him to build it. You can't go to a bird and teach him to do a different kind of nest. You can't go. So it has no relationship. Otherwise, we'd look around and we'd see that animals share control of the environment like we do. They don't. The smartest animals still are a servant to their environment. They have to go north or south if the weather changes. They have to go higher or lower in the ocean, depending. In other words, animals have certain instincts which they have evolved to take advantage of their environment to a certain extent. Human beings have unlimited imagination. We can conceive things in our mind. So you can... how many of you have read a book and then seen the movie, and you said the movie is nothing like what the book looked like?
Mm-hmm.
Has that ever happened to you?
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people say, I don't even want to see the movie because the book, is too good. Isn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
How many of you have seen the movie first, then read the book, and found it hard now to not see the movie in your mind? Yeah, it kind of ruins it for you, wouldn't you agree? But does that show you that you have the ability to see a movie in your mind? Would you agree? This is a very important spiritual power. It's the power of imagination. Now, we need to understand that we need the power of imagination to see God and to see truth. In the same way that you need your physical eyes to see that table, you need your spiritual eyes to see certain spiritual things. You need this. Okay, Abdu'l-Baha says there's another spiritual power. And this one he called the power of reflection. By the way, there's 5 spiritual powers and 5 physical powers. It's kind of like, there's 5. Now the next one he calls is the power of reflection. Reflection, he says, is the ability to think. He called it thought or reflection. Okay? It has to do also with consciousness. How many of you have ever just sat in your bed, closed your eyes, and realized that you're conscious? This first occurred to the philosopher René Descartes. He was a French philosopher, and he was trying to figure out philosophy. And as he was thinking about it, he said, the fact that I'm thinking about it makes me realize that there is a consciousness that's separate. Okay, he says it's separate. And then he wrote the famous lines, it came to him in French, I can't remember what it is, but in English, I think, therefore I am. That your real reality is the fact that you're thinking, it's not your body. And he then created a theory called duality. Duality means two worlds. And it's called Cartesian duality. Have you ever heard this term in philosophy or in history? They call it Cartesian because Descartes means Cartesian. Cartesian duality means that there's two worlds. There's a physical world and a mental/spiritual world. And just by lying in your bed, closing your eyes, you can realize that there are these two worlds. This is a very important thing. And this, Adabaha says, is the power of reflection, the power of thought, the power of consciousness. This is called in science the hard question. There's many books written, they call consciousness the hard question, because science can't deal with it. They can't measure it. I mean, they can measure its effects, but where does it come from? Where does consciousness come from? They're not comfortable with it because we have a box here. Okay, it's a little box, and it's the physical world, and it's everything physical. And everything within the physical world, we should be able to understand within the box. And now someone comes along and says there's something outside the box. Okay? They come along and say there's something outside the box. And the scientists say, prove it from within the box. It can't be done. You can't prove within the box. Imagine right now that there's a world that's a box. Just imagine there's a world within a box. Let's say it's 50 miles wide. And there's a big border and there's a box everywhere. Okay? And all your parents tell you never go near the edge of the box. Stay in the box your whole life. So you stay in the box. So a couple of your friends come to you and say, we're going to go to the edge of the box. And you say, no, I can't go to the edge of the box. I've been warned by a friend. No, come on, it's a lot of fun. So you go to the edge of the box. And let's say you go to the edge of the box. And you listen and you hear something outside the box. Let's say somebody calls you from outside the box. Let's say it's your father who's dead. And he says, Ziba. So you go back to your parents and you say, there's more to life than this box. There's something outside the box. I heard it. They say, no. If you can't see, if it's not in the box, it doesn't exist. This is what we call materialism. Materialism is the idea that only what's in the physical world exists, and if it can't be proven within the physical world, then it, by definition, doesn't exist. It is part of your imagination. It's part of your imagination. It's a figment of your imagination. It's something that we just kind of conceived out of our brain. But it can't possibly exist because it can't be proven from within the box. Now, this is materialism. What Baha'u'llah said is that this whole world is just a box. In fact, he even told a story about how there was a play, and the puppeteer did the whole play. Did anyone read that quotation? Mm-hmm. The puppeteer did the whole play and everything, and the king got killed and this and that. And then he put everything back in the box and closed the box and walked away from behind the tent. And Baha'u'llah he said he was, how old?
As a child.
He was a little child.
7, 8 years
Yeah,
old.
and he went up and he said, what's in that box? And the puppeteer man said, everything you saw on stage is now within that box.
The royal court, I think.
It was a royal, yes, it was called, yeah. And so Baha'u'llah said from that point on, he viewed this whole world just like that box. He viewed the world. So this is a very important concept. You transcend the box every time you use your first two spiritual powers. Every time you use your first two spiritual powers, you transcend the box because now you're seeing things that are not in the box. You're thinking about things that they don't exist in the box. Even scientists prove this. So these are two spiritual powers. Now you need to use both, and they are different. When you meditate, you need to use all 5 of your spiritual powers. You can't just meditate with one. And so I developed a practice of meditation called the 5 powers meditation. I took these 2 and the next 3. And I try to use all five. In the same way that if you wanted to enjoy the world, you would use all five, wouldn't you? You would look at something, you would hear something, you would taste something, and smell something. Now, do you know what the next three spiritual powers are? You don't know? The next one, he says, is comprehension. Okay, so what's the first one? Imagination. What's the second one?
Reflection.
Thought or reflection. Sometimes I call it thoughts. He has different terms for it, but I call it thought or reflection. And the next one is comprehension. Now, which of these correspond to the physical? What do you think imagination is? Of the five outward senses, what do you think imagination is the inward sense of?
Hearing.
You think it's hearing? I think it's vision. I think it's your eyes. Because imagination or inner vision, that's what I think. But he never said this. I think that reflection is hearing. But it could be the other way around. But it's very clear that if you look at the physical senses, the first two act at a distance, and the last three are more dangerous. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Okay. You have two physical senses, hearing and seeing, that act at a distance. Would you agree? They act at a distance. Vision, you see, that acts at the greatest distance, and hearing acts at the second greatest distance. But they're not particularly dangerous. You can't die from looking at something ugly, unless it's really ugly. Okay? And you also cannot die from hearing something that you don't like. You could perhaps damage your hearing if it was really, really loud. But basically, they act at a distance, therefore you use them first. You understand these? You use these two first. Then you've got three that are very close to you. They're extremely dangerous. Okay? If you eat something, or smell or inhale something that's poisonous, you die. Would you agree? If you touch something, or if you get hurt, or you get knocked over, or your arm gets cut off, anything to do with the sense of touch, you have to protect those more. Would you agree? So you protect them with the two first ones, because you survey at a distance, and then you look, and then you use smell next, and then if it smells good, it looks good, it sees good, you might put it in your mouth and eat it. But didn't those earlier senses protect the other senses? But which of the senses are most essential for life? Okay, let's get this straight. If you don't eat anything, and if you don't breathe, how long do you live? You die, right? Okay, but if you don't see and you don't hear, how long can you live? Okay, so the others are both more dangerous and more valuable. Would you agree? They're both more dangerous and they're more valuable. So they're protected. It's the same with the spiritual powers. First, you use your imagination. People don't understand that when you imagine, you are seeing reality. Let's get this clear. How many of you know that Einstein in 1905, when he didn't have a laboratory, he didn't have a microscope, he didn't have a position in a university, he was actually a clerk in a patent office, discovered the complete nature of gravity and time and light. Do you know this?
No.
Okay, you know the theory, Einstein's theory of relativity, completely revolutionized our understanding of the physical world. Are you familiar with this? In basic sense?
Right.
How did he do it?
Imagine it.
Exactly. That's all he did. He did it in his mind. First of all, most of the theoretical physicists, they worked in universities and they had laboratories and they had microscopes and telescopes and things. He had none of that. He had his brain and his brain alone. And he was thinking about the nature of light and how light travels. And I don't know if you understand this, that light always travels at the same speed. Did you know that? It always travels at the same speed, but it doesn't matter if the light source is moving or not. Do you understand what's going on here? Okay, let's say that you're driving a car towards me. And let's say you're driving towards me on a road, let's say you're 10 miles away, and you're coming at me at 100 miles an hour. And I can take a detector and I can detect your speed. It's coming at me at 100 miles an hour. Okay, now, let's say you stop the car, and now the light comes at me. You turn your headlights on, but you're stopped. You turn the headlights on, and we can detect the speed of light. It's 186,000 miles a second. Okay, 90, I can't remember how many billions an hour, but it's a very, very speed. But we can measure it. It comes at that speed. So now, let's say you start driving towards me, 100 miles an hour, and you turn your headlights on. What should the speed of light be when it reaches me now? Should it be that fast plus 100 miles an hour?
You say it doesn't change.
It still comes at me at the same speed. So we say, that's still weird. Turn around and drive away from me at 100 miles an hour. So now she turns around and turn on your taillights. And now I measure the taillights coming. And they still come at the same speed. We say, what's the story here? Okay, well, get out of your car and get in a spaceship. And leave me at, 1,000,000 miles an hour. The light still comes at the same speed. Says, how does light do it? Do you understand? Very simple thing that we knew since the 1860s. Maxwell figured this out, and they worked out, and various other tests showed that light always moves at the same speed. So all Einstein did, let's get this right, he thought about this, and he thought, this is very strange, because the speed of light is always the same, no matter what's going on. So I want you to imagine something right now. Okay, I'll give you a simple test. Imagine you're on a train, and you're on the train right now, and the train's going at 60 miles an hour, and a fly flies in the train past you at 1 mile an hour. Okay? So here I'm in the train, and the fly goes past me at 1 mile an hour. So I'm going to measure the speed of that fly. How fast do I measure it? 1 mile an hour, would you agree? Okay, you got that? Fly's definitely going, and I measured it, and I had a good measurement. 1 mile an hour. So now outside, let's say there's a man sitting outside. The train goes by, and it's going by at 60 miles an hour, and on the train is a fly going at 1 mile an hour. So now how fast does he measure that fly in relation to him?
61.
Exactly. The fly is definitely, would you agree? Okay, so let's agree. The one guy measures the fly 1 mile an hour, another guy measures the fly 61 miles an hour. Definitely they're both right. Would you agree? Because they have two different frame of reference. Now, let's say somebody comes along and says, the speed of fly, instead of the speed of time, the speed of fly is always the same. It's always the same. It can't be any different. If he measures it here, they're always going to measure it the same. So let's say now they measure it's the same. And you say, well, if they're the same, but they're different, how could that be? And that's, you have to say then that the ruler is different. You see? The ruler has to be different for them to be the same. So how can 61 equal 1? You have to have a different ruler. Would you agree? Now, what is the ruler for speed? What is the actual ruler for speed? What is speed? The ruler for speed.
Over time.
Distance and time. Would you understand? Distance and time. So the ruler for speed is time. Time and space, actually, if you want to know the truth. Time and space are the two things. How much space or distance can you travel in how much time? That's what speed actually is. Now, if that changes, that means that time and space have to change if you're traveling. Time and space have to change if you're traveling. Now, how many people can accept that as a concept? You can? Seriously? The majority of the people, it's over 110 years since he proposed this. Majority of people still, we can't accept that. But it's true. Time, if you travel fast, time moves at a different rate. And also space changes too. Time and space actually change. Now, the reason I say this is that Einstein not only proposed it in beautiful language and mathematical certainty, and then proposed various tests that he said will prove it. And some of these tests, one of them wasn't even proved until 1971. Because in 1971, they had perfected atomic clocks. Who knows what an atomic clock is? I'm sorry? Okay, let's get this right. Everything in the universe spins. Would you agree? If you look out there, you see the moon spins, and the earth spins, and the stars, and actually, in fact, all the galaxies, all the nebulae, everything spins. it spins so regularly that we decided to mark time by using it. So originally, we marked time by the motion of the sun around the earth, or the sun completing the cycle. So we could have a year, or we could have a day. Would you agree? That's how we first marked time. Then finally we found the sun was quite regular, so we could put it here in the shadow and make a dial. And we found that the motion of the sun could give us time. And so then we developed timepieces where we could use some gravity to weigh down something and have a ticking and so on. And we had watches. How precise were the watches? When you were growing up, how precise, did a watch get out by a minute or two every couple of months? It was as good as we could get using the sun, the earth, and various motions. So in the middle part of the 20th century, or actually more like the 60s and 70s, we found that everything else is vibrating in the universe. Everything is vibrating. So smaller things are also vibrating. So we found that quartz crystals were vibrating. So we took quartz crystals and we measured the vibration of coming out, and we found that that was just as consistent as the Earth, but much faster. So we created clocks. And did you notice that watches got really cheap around about 1985, 86 or something, or some period in the 80s? Do you remember that? And all watches got really good because they started, and it said quartz action, and they were better. That's because we realized that we could do that. So then later they found that there's certain kinds of atoms. Atoms are actually spinning, because an atom is actually, in a way, just like the sun or the earth, just on a smaller level. And that was coming at us, I don't even know how many hundreds of billions of times a second it's spinning. You know, like the earth, it takes a year to go around, okay, the sun. This thing is doing billions of times a second. So we started to measure that, and we made our clocks based on that. And these clocks are so precise that they will not lose 1/1,000,000th of a second in 100,000 years. Take two of them, synchronize. If Jesus had one of these clocks, and his disciples, and they said, synchronize your watches, and today they walked in the room and their watches would still be to the 1,000,000th of a second. Because that's how regular the spinning of the atom is that we happen to use for atomic. So we call these atomic clocks. Okay, now why did I say that? Because Einstein said, if you got in an airplane, well, I don't even, there weren't even airplanes when he did, but at some stage in his life, he said, you get an airplane, travel long enough, okay, then time will have gone a little slower. But now we have these atomic clocks where we'd put two of them side by side, and they would be in sync. And in 100,000 years, they'd still be in sync. They would not lose their sync. So they take two of these clocks, and they put one on a 747 in 1971. Take it around the world. Okay, and bring it back down. And they were out of sync.
They were?
Yep. And Einstein had predicted it. Time didn't move as fast. Okay. And this is why airline pilots live longer than the rest of us.
And people who
In life.
go to the International Space Station the longest.
Yes. But when I say airline pilots live a little longer than us, by a few billionth of a second. But they do. They have slightly longer. But of course, yes, the space shuttle people, they'll do that. Now, in addition, so Einstein figured this out, predicted it, and now of course if you go faster than 747, the time will slow down more. If you could go halfway to the speed of light or a quarter of the speed of light, and we actually know exactly how much time will slow down. This is why they say if you got in a spaceship and traveled really fast, and it only took you a year to get there as far as you were concerned, came back and it was 2 years or 3 years or whatever. Let's say it's 3 light years away, and let's say you went near the speed of light, you might take 6 years to go there and back, you come back, and the Earth is now 60 or 100 years further ahead. And you're actually younger than your great-grandchildren. So you've heard of these kind of scientific stories. It's absolutely plausible if you could just do the traveling. The other thing that messes with time is gravity. So when gravity is around, it also messes with time. It also messes with time. And so as a result, if you're close to a gravitational force, time moves at a certain speed, and then if you're away from a gravitational force, it moves at a different speed. We first learned this with the satellites. They weren't in sync. And the clocks, you take it to atomic clock there and atomic clock there, and their time is different. We have to adjust. This is what we have to do every time we use your cell phone and use a GPS, it has to change, the clocks have to...
Tom, you were talking about the spiritual. This, what you're saying, is it about the imagination?
I want to explain to you that this is a very complex thing. And Einstein did not figure this out with instruments and with laboratories and with microscopes. He saw it. Now, of course, he understood a little bit of truth from what had been written and the theories, but he figured it out. This is the way most scientific discoveries. Philo Farnsworth, do you know who he was? 14-year-old boy, credited with the discovery and the invention of television. Television, as you know, is a very complex thing. How to send that kind of circuit and transmit it into radio waves and to send it. And Philo Farnsworth was in high school, and he was plowing potatoes in Idaho. He was a potato farmer's son, plowing it. And as he was plowing, he visualized the way in which the circuit should be done. He goes to his high school teacher and describes it. High school teacher writes it down. And then later on they work on it, invent it, and so on. So when television is finally invented, the greatest scientist in the world, who worked for RCA Victor, and he was the Russian professor, they tried to patent TV. And the US Supreme Court heard the case. And the high school teacher brought in Philo Farnsworth papers, and they had this professor from Moscow working for RCA, and they looked at it and they said, no, this little boy gets the patent for TV, not the Russian professor. He had invented it first, and he didn't have a laboratory, he had his brain and his potato field.
Oh, you're saying that through the power of the soul, these people, they imagine it?
Now what
which
Adabaha
sense they use?
said that the human mind, the human spirit, is able to perceive reality. We think that when you imagine something in your mind, it's fictitious. It's part of your imagination. But Einstein and Farnsworth were not seeing phony things. They were seeing reality that I can't even hardly explain to you. So therefore, your soul has the ability to see reality through the spiritual powers of imagination and reflection, in the same way that your physical eyes can see tables. Don't think that imagination is just, oh, it's just your imagination. Like, people say, it's just your imagination. Well, okay, maybe some things are like that, but you have a spiritual power of vision. Okay, so now you have imagination, you have thought, and you have comprehension. I think comprehension is eating. What do you think? Or is it smelling? I don't really know. You think it's smelling?
I would say smell.
That's what a lot of people say. When I give my talks, I say that the first thing you do is you look at something. Because you want to be sure that it's safe. Would you agree? You're walking through the jungle or something like that. You look at it first. Okay. Now you also might listen to it. You're not going to eat it until you've done those two things. But even before you eat it, what are you going to do?
Smell.
You are going to smell it. Wouldn't you agree? So I think that this is a spiritual path. First imagine something, then reflect upon the imagination, which is think about the imagination. First look at something, then think about what you're looking at. Then eat it. Which is comprehension. Or no. No, you're just smelling it. You're actually not eating it yet. Then just comprehend it. Okay.
But it's just as dangerous.
It's more dangerous.
Just as dangerous.
Smelling can be more dangerous. Well, you could smell something and not die and realize it's eating. Okay, then Adabaha says the fourth power, and it's a mysterious power, he refers to as memory. But it's an interesting power. I don't think it's just memory like we think of it. It's more like storage. It's more like hitting the save button in Windows, in the computer. It's something where you actually, that's eating. I think that this fourth spiritual power is the eating. So first you look at something with your spiritual eye, then you meditate upon it, reflect upon it with your spiritual ears, then you comprehend it with your spiritual nose, I guess, then you eat it with your spiritual memory or storage. And then he says the fifth spiritual power, which is the great one. The fifth spiritual power, he has called it by two different terms in two different passages. One he calls it the common faculty, and the other he calls it the sympathetic nerve. And basically he says that there has to be some faculty which coordinates all the other faculties and communicates with the physical body. Because the physical body is associated with the spirit. But in what way? How does the spirit associate with your body? You have a spirit and it's bodiless. How does it end up getting into your brain or into your mind? He says there's a faculty, and it's called the common faculty. The common faculty, or the sympathetic nerve, is the thing that enables the physical senses to communicate to the spirit and the spirit to communicate back to. It is the umbilical cord of the connection. Now, if you look at the physical body, the king of the senses is what we call the sense of touch. Because the sense of touch is actually not just that. The sense of touch is what we call the central nervous system, which actually causes all the other senses to work. Do you understand this? In other words, right now you have a brain, and that brain is connected by thousands and thousands of electrical lines. There's so many I can't even count. Does anyone know how many there are? We'll look it up on the internet. Someone look it up and tell me. But probably it's thousands or maybe even millions of circuits that your brain connects. And at every time it's coordinated through this central nervous system. So like touch your toe to something and your brain knows what it is. In fact, even close your eyes and touch your toe around it, you can imagine, what shape it is. Would you agree?
Yeah.
It's all through the power of the central nervous system. Everything that you use in the other senses requires on the central nervous system as well. So for example, if you see something, what's really happening is the light is reflecting and going into the retina of the eyes, the cones of the eyes, and then it's going into the brain. So there's still, the central nervous system is causing the eyes to see. The eyes couldn't see without the central nervous system. How do your ears hear? Well, there's a vibration of the things. How do you taste? Well, there's something in your taste buds that then can detect it and then send it. So without the central nervous system, would any of the other four senses work? It's really the king of senses. Would you agree? And Baha'u'llah says in one passage, he says, think about the sense of touch, how wondrous it is, that it is, he says that all the other senses are localized in one organ. The sense of touch is in every single spot in your body. I can cut you open and touch any spot of your body and you can feel it. Because there's a nerve ending in virtually
Except
every...
for your eyes and your brain. That's it.
Okay, when you touch your eyes, it doesn't hurt?
Well,
You can feel it.
yeah.
Okay, if I touch your eyes, I can't feel it? Do you want to try?
There's no nerves on your
Oh yeah, okay. Maybe a few places there aren't nerves. And there's a few spots in your body also that, like my fingernails, if I pinch my fingernail alone, I don't feel anything, do you? Or it's my hair or something. There's a few things that you don't have. But the point is that Baha'u'llah says, think how wondrous the sense of touch is, that it's not localized, it's everywhere. Now, this fifth spiritual power is that equivalent spiritually. It is the spiritual nervous system. Abdu'l-Baha called it the sympathetic nerve. So it's a way that we communicate. Now, I want you to think of your brain as being a train station. Your brain is a train station. And you have 5 trains coming from the west and 5 trains coming from the east. Let's say it's Grand Central Station. Does that make sense? Now, the 5 trains coming from the west all come from inside the box. They all come from the physical world. They come from your eyes, from your nose, your mouth, and they go into that train station. And now you've got 5 other trains coming in. And they come from the spiritual side. And they all meet in your brain. Okay? But the means, the chief conductor of the trains is the 5th of the spiritual powers. It's the sympathetic nerve. It's the one that does it all. For some reason, most of us are getting more trains from the west. Most of us are getting more trains into your brain or coming from the physical world. But every now and then you get trains from the spiritual world as well. Now, every night, when the trains stop coming from the physical world, they stop, the schedule runs out and there's no more trains coming in, and you go to sleep, and gradually your eyes get turned off, your ears get turned off. Then, for some reason, the trains from the you start coming more. And everyone has found, in all kinds of spiritual disciplines, that a certain amount of sensory deprivation of these 5 trains causes an increase in the arrival of these trains. It's almost like the trains don't really like to bump into each other. Okay, and this is why Baha'u'llah says, close one eye and open the other. Close one to the physical world and open one to the spiritual world. Many times he says, oh man of 2 visions, because we have 2 visions. We have the vision on this side and we have the vision on this side. He says, don't look so much at this side. He doesn't say, shut it off entirely. In fact, he prohibits you from shutting it off entirely. But he says, shut it off to a certain extent, and then you're able to receive this input from these 5 trains. So all meditation is learning to use your 5 spiritual powers, your 5 spiritual senses, and you realize that you have enormous power and capacity. The power of memory is so misunderstood by human beings. I don't know how many of you know this, that the power of human memory is virtually unlimited if someone applies it. There are people who have memorized the whole Bible. There are people who have memorized the whole Quran. You know the Quran is harder to memorize than the Bible, it's longer. At least longer than the New Testament. Do you know that? There are people that have memorized. There was one of the early followers of the faith, his name was Sayyid Kazem. He had memorized the entire Quran at the age of 14. And I've read in the newspaper people that have done this. It's not unlimited. Little children go to school and they get put in a play, usually in elementary school. They come home and they say, I've got to learn all these lines. I'll never be able to do it. I don't know if you've seen. And they go and they learn it, and usually within a day or 2 they have the lines. And it's a universally recognized phenomenon that all kids learn their plays in school, and yet they didn't think they could do it. And they're just amazed. Now, do you know why children can learn lines in a play? Does anyone know why? There's a reason. It's pretty obvious if you think about it.
Your brain is fresh.
No, you can learn it too. If you're in a play, okay, let me take all the lines. I cast you in a play, you're going to play Cleopatra or something like that. And I take all your lines and I take them out of the play and put them in one book, just your lines. And you look at it, you say, there's no way I can memorize 20 pages, like it's a 200-page play and 20 pages are me. I can't memorize 20 pages. And yet you do memorize it usually within a few days or a week at best. Why do you? And the reason is this, is that when you associate memory with visualization, the memory is about 5 to 10 times easier and faster and longer retained. In other words, if you visualize something along with it, which is another spiritual power, because when you're learning a play, it's a scene in which I'm walking over here and she puts the table down and I say, well, thank you very much. Then she hands it back to me and I say, that's the ugliest thing I ever saw. And so, in other words, you're associating the physical line with imagining the action of the play. Would you agree? That causes you to memorize it. The power of memory is very, very great. So you learn to memorize very quickly. Now, when we go to school, they do not teach us how to use our 5 spiritual powers. In fact, they reward us not to use them. Let me get this clear. They reward us not to use them. Because what the teacher does is the teacher says, what is the answer to such and such a question? Okay? And the kid raises, good, Johnny, you got it quickly. The teacher didn't tell them to visualize it. The teacher didn't tell them to meditate and think about it. You see, the teacher just said comprehend it. Bypassing those 2 things that led Einstein to come to theories and led Farnsworth, they just want you to just comprehend. If someone came to you right now and said, don't look, open your eyes, don't smell it, just open your mouth and eat what I stick in your mouth. How many would do that if I blindfolded you now? You wouldn't do it. And yet we do that with education. Sometimes we even go to memory. Sometimes we say, I don't want to imagine it. I don't want to think about it. I don't even want to comprehend or understand it. Just let me memorize it so I can pass this test.
Well, that's what they do now.
How many people have done that?
They teach to the test.
Yeah. So just bypass all the elements of your spiritual powers. Do not think about it. Don't imagine. Don't comprehend. And don't just memorize it. Just memorize. Just eat it. And consequently, we're eating all kinds of mental junk food, spiritual junk food, the Taco Bell. I mean, the McDonald's. So we need to relearn how to become spiritual by using our spiritual powers. Now, have you noticed that Jesus used the loss of physical senses as a means to describe the loss of spiritual power? Have you noticed this? He talked about people that were blind. But it's quite clear from the context that they weren't physically blind. He talked about people that were deaf, but they weren't physically deaf. And he also referred to lepers. And leprosy is the loss of physical touch. That's the symptom of leprosy. In other words, the symptom of deafness is loss of hearing. The symptom of blindness is loss of sight. The symptom of leprosy is loss of touch. And so whenever he refers to lepers or blind or deaf, he's referring to those that are spiritually lacking in the spiritual, one of these 5 spiritual powers. We are all lepers, and we are all deaf, and we are all blind, and you understand, in the same way. Likewise, if you look at the Baha'i writings, he always tells us to partake of spiritual truth in relation to all 5 of the senses. You can go into the prayers or the writings, and he'll say, "Taste ye the divine sweetness of the Lord," or "Cause me to taste the divine sweetness," okay, or something. "From the sweet-scented streams of thine eternity, give me to drink, oh my God." So we've got sense of taste. He talks about gaze on the beauty of the beloved. He talks about inhale the fragrance. He says, the delightsome words of my honeyed tongue. Or we can hear the nightingale. I'm sorry, we can cling to the cord or touch the hem of the garment and so on. He's an equal opportunity sensory thing, because he's trying to tell us at every time that the spiritual world needs to be eaten, it needs to be inhaled, it needs to be tasted, it needs to be touched. Did you see what I mean? Okay.
Christ, when in the party they say he changed the water into wine, then that is more a spiritual thing.
Yes.
It doesn't go open.
Almost every physical thing that Jesus did in the Bible, it has a spiritual meaning. Mm-hmm. They understood this. He walked on water. That means he was able to traverse all knowledge.